Hi everyone and welcome to tonight's webinar. It's the first one of the autumn series, I suppose, and welcome back after the summer. Tonight's webinar is the launch of the revised core competency framework. And first of all, I'm Emily Kelly. I'm one of the peer support pharmacists and I'll be helping to facilitate this evening. Some domestics to start with. If I could ask you all to make sure that your microphones are on mute. The webinar is going to be recorded. You can turn your videos on or off as you wish. And if you're experiencing any problems with connectivity, it might be best to just turn off your video. If you have difficulty with sound, just make sure that your speaker is not muted or that maybe the volume on your computer or phone is not turned down. Another thing that might work is just logging in and out sometimes with the sound. If you have any questions that pop into your head as we go through the presentations, you can pop them into the chat box and there'll be time for a Q&A at the end. Now, I know there was an opportunity to send in some questions or comments in advance of this webinar, and a lot of those will be covered during Alicia's section of the presentation. And we may also use some anonymised information from the webinar in the future. So I'm only delighted to welcome tonight our speakers. So Joanne Kissane, the Registrar and Chief Officer of the Pharmaceutical Society of Ireland. Dan Burns, Professional Standards Manager, also with the Pharmaceutical Society of Ireland, and Alicia O'Dwyer, Quality Assurance Pharmacist and ePortfolio Review Project Lead. A bit of a mouthful, Alicia. Welcome tonight, and Dan is going to take you through what the new core competency framework is and what the detail is there, and then Alicia will go through what are the practical implications of that, and she'll cover a lot of the questions that were sent in advance. So I'm going to hand you over now to the Registrar of the PSI, Joanne Kissane, to do a brief introduction.
Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. And I suppose your presence tonight is a testament to your own commitment to lifelong learning and continuing professional development. At the outset, I'd like to thank the colleagues in the IIOP for hosting the event and for working in partnership and collaboration with the PSI in the implementation of the new core competency framework. So we in PSI are absolutely delighted to provide you with information this evening on the development and the changes to the core competency framework. But I'd like to encourage all of you and all pharmacists that you know and work with to attend the upcoming roadshows that are being hosted by the Institute of Pharmacy, where further information on the practical implementations of the revised core competency framework will be provided, along with an opportunity for you to network and to meet with your fellow pharmacists. As you're all aware, the core competency framework is a tool to support pharmacists in identifying our continuing professional development needs by self-reflecting against the domains and competencies that are relevant to our roles. In preparing for tonight's webinar, I took the opportunity to download a copy of the revised core competency framework and review the email sent to me by the Irish Institute of Pharmacy as to the impact of the revised core competency framework on my own CPD activities. Throughout the webinar, I would encourage everyone to think about how you will incorporate the revised core competency framework into your CPD activities, how you will use it to self-assess how you meet the competencies relevant to your role, and identify areas for further development. Furthermore, I'd like to take this opportunity to draw your attention to the upcoming roadshows that will be delivered by the PSI this October in various locations around the country. An email was sent to all registrants today, and my colleagues and I look forward to meeting you in person and providing you with updates on our work and areas of interest to the profession. I'd like to take this opportunity to warmly invite you to attend those events and look forward to meeting you. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Dan Burns, who will bring us through the development of the revised core competency framework, give an overview of what has changed, and provide some examples about how you might use the new revised core competency framework to support your CPD. Thank you once again, and I hope you enjoy tonight's webinar.
Thank you, Joanne, and good evening, everybody. And I'm very happy to be here this evening to talk to you about the revised core competency framework for pharmacists and what that means for you. My name is Dan Burns. I'm one of the pharmacists here at the PSI and the Professional Standards Manager. Emily, can you just confirm that the screen is sharing okay there and that you can see?
Yeah, Dan, everything's perfect. The slides are good and we can hear you clear.
Thanks, Emily. So what we'll cover today. So in tonight's presentation, we're going to go through what the core competency framework is and what are its uses. I'll tell you why it was updated and go over some of the key changes that were made when we revised the framework. I'll provide an overview of its structure, so talk through some of the domains, competencies, and behaviours. And then we'll finish this evening, hopefully to bring the core competency framework to life through some case studies, where we'll provide examples of how you might use the core competency framework to support your CPD. So starting off with what is the core competency framework and its uses. So before we talk about the framework, we'll take a step back and just actually talk about competencies themselves, just to explain what we mean when we say competencies. So competencies refer to the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors that an individual develops through education, training, and work experience. In turn, a competency framework is a blueprint that combines competencies and behaviors expected of a professional in their role. And then the core competency framework for pharmacists reflects the practice of pharmacists in the early stages of their career. So that's those in the 0 to 3 years registered category. But it is also used to provide structure and guidance for pharmacists when reflecting on their continuing professional development or CPD needs throughout their career. It's important to think about the place of the core competency framework within the other tools available to pharmacists to support their practice. So the core competency framework is one of a number of tools, along with legislation, the code of conduct, standards, guidance, and assessment systems that underpin and support the practice of pharmacists in Ireland. And also worth noting that there is a legislative basis and a requirement for the PSI to have a core competency framework, and that's set out in the Pharmaceutical Society of Ireland Education and Training Rules 2014. That is where the basis for the core competency framework is set out. So what are the main uses of the core competency framework? Well, firstly, it underpins the education and training of pharmacy students, and it's a fundamental component of the accreditation standards for the MPharm programme, the Masters of Pharmacy that is in place in the Schools of Pharmacy in Ireland. So the framework is used by the Schools of Pharmacy in the development of curricula and by students while on experiential learning placements as part of their assessments. Secondly, as per the focus of tonight's webinar, the framework is a fundamental component of our CPD system, and it is an important tool to support pharmacists in identifying their CPD needs. And all pharmacists are expected to self-assess the core competency framework to identify their areas for development. And then there are some other functions as well, which include that it informs the professional registration exam. It also informs the accreditation standards for CPD programs, and it provides a platform for the development of advanced practice. So why was the framework updated? Well, first of all, we're required within the PSI to review the framework at intervals not exceeding 5 years. And the reason for that is that it ensures that the competencies and behaviours included in the framework are reflective of current practice. So the review that resulted in this revised framework that we're talking about tonight commenced in 2019. Was impacted somewhat by the COVID-19 pandemic, but was picked back up and then concluded in December 2022 when the revised framework was approved by the PSI Council. And in terms of the steps that we took to get to that point, it was a multi-step process, and I just suppose we'll walk through these just in a little bit of detail, just to give some reassurance as to the approach that we took in developing the revised framework. So step one was gathering feedback and a benchmarking exercise. So this consisted of a number of meetings with external stakeholders, and the purpose of these was to gather feedback on the current framework and its application, and what was needed from the profession from a framework into the future. Following this, a comprehensive review and benchmarking exercise was conducted of international pharmacy competency frameworks, and this identified potential gaps and amendments that could be incorporated into a revised core competency framework. Finally, a consultation process was undertaken with the profession, and feedback was gathered on the core competency framework from pharmacists and others. The next step was the establishment of a steering group, and this comprised of relevant stakeholders from across the pharmacy, health and education sectors. And their role as part of the steering group was to work with the PSI and the project team to advise and make recommendations, and to our council and advisory committees and the working group on the development of a revised core competency framework. And regular meetings took place with the steering group throughout the project. We also established a working group by way of an expression of interest, and many of you may have been part of that working group. It comprised of 50 members, the majority of whom were pharmacists employed in different areas of practice and with a wide range of experience and expertise. And 4 workshops took place with the working group members throughout the project. We also then undertook an expert review which was carried out by an expert in competency frameworks who reviewed the revised draft framework and provided commentary on its suitability and its appropriateness as a competency framework. Following this, we published a draft version of the framework, and this was available to all pharmacists and other stakeholders to review and comment the draft revised framework. And following this, there was some further changes made. However, at that point, it was very well received, and it was very positively reviewed by those who took part of the public consultation, who considered that it was an improvement on the previous version and that it did reflect changes in practice that had taken place since the first framework was published. So that moved then to being presented to the PSI Council in December 2022. And as I mentioned earlier, our council approved the framework at its December meeting in 2022. And from then, early this year, we've been working with both the Schools of Pharmacy in Appel and the IIOP on implementation of the framework, and working with them to make sure that the framework is implemented in an organised and timely manner, and incorporated both into the curricula for the Schools of Pharmacy and into our system for CPD with the IIOP. So just to give an overview of the structure and key changes associated with the core competency framework. So any of you who will have interacted with the previous version of the core competency framework will be aware that there are 3 main parts to it. So it consists of domains, competencies, and behaviors. So the revised core competency framework includes 5 domains, and each domain is a broad area of responsibility or professional endeavor. And within the framework, a description is provided of each domain. Under each domain, then, there's a number of competencies, and a competency describes activities or processes in relation to the overall expectation of the domain. And then further, below the competencies is a number of indicative behavior statements, and these describe how the competency may be demonstrated in practice. So then highlighting what has changed and what is different in this new revised core competency framework. So first of all, the number of domains has been reduced from 6 to 5. And you see on the right there a summary of the domains and competencies. So the domains start at the person, move on to the professional, move on to the pharmacist within the workplace, then consider the domain-specific actions of pharmacists in practice, and end with the responsibilities of pharmacists as they relate to public health. The competencies have also been updated. So some competencies have been removed or merged, for example, where there was some duplication. And then new competencies have been added to reflect changes in practice. The number of behaviors has also been reduced by approximately 1/3. And that was one of the consistent pieces of feedback that we received, that there was too many behaviors in the previous version. So a significant effort went to try and consolidate and reduce the number of behaviors and reduce any duplication that existed. And also then existing behaviors that remain have been strengthened and new behaviors have been added. And these cover areas such as advancements in technology, administration of vaccines, sustainability, antimicrobial stewardship, pandemic preparedness, equality, diversity and inclusion, continuous quality improvement, self-care and well-being, and patient empowerment. And then throughout the framework, the language has been updated in an effort to improve clarity, with competencies in the active voice and indicative behaviors in the first person. And the reason for those language updates is to assist pharmacists and students when they're using the framework to better assess whether a competency and a behaviour is relevant to them and their role. So what I'm going to do now is just go through each of the domains, and I won't go through all of the competencies and behaviours, but I will pull out a few that have been added, a few behaviours that have been added to just, I suppose, bring to life a little bit what we mean when we say when I describe some of the changes in the previous slide. So under the domain 1, which is personal, and under competency 1.3, which is establishes and maintains collaborative working relationships, we've added a new behaviour in relation to care transitions. So it's, I'm aware of the risk to patients during care transitions and complete effective handovers with colleagues and other health professionals to ensure continuity of care. And this was in recognition of the importance of care transitions and the risk that they can present to patients from a safety perspective, and the important role that pharmacists have in ensuring those safe transitions, both within their practice and as patients transition between different care settings. Another example within the same domain is under competency 1.4, which is communicates effectively. And this is the behavior that we've added in relation to EDI obligations. So this is that I'm cognizant of my obligations in relation to equality, diversity, and inclusion in my interactions with patients, colleagues, and other health professionals. And I think it goes without saying that that's an important aspect of practice and of our interactions with patients, our colleagues, and other health professionals, and was an important addition to the competency framework. Under domain 2, which is professional, again, just to pull out some examples. So under competency 2.1, which is applies a person-centered approach, a new behavior has been added in relation to the education and empowerment of patients. So it's I educate and empower patients to manage their own health and medicines and assist them to make informed choices. And I guess that's become more important in practice as more and more information is available to patients and they have more choices relating to their health and their medicines. And it's recognizing the important role that pharmacists have in assisting patients with making informed decisions and choices. And then under competency 2.4, which is adapts to change and innovation, a new behavior has been added in recognition of the important advancements that have been made in e-health and technology. And this is that I maintain digital competence relevant to my role and embrace technology and innovation that can improve safety, efficacy, and efficiency of patient care. And I suppose it's important to think of, you know, the advancements that have been made in recent years in relation to electronic patient records within hospitals, within primary care, with the advancement of HealthMail and PharmaVax and other digital solutions that have been introduced, and the importance of being open to adopting those into practice where they're going to improve safety and efficiency and efficacy of care. Then under domain 3, looking at organization and management skills, again, looking at some of the important behaviors that have been added here. So under competency 3.1, manages self, and in recognition of the significant stress and burnout reported by pharmacists, particularly over recent years during the pandemic, the importance of pharmacists taking steps to look after their own health and well-being. So the behavior there, as you see, is I take steps to look after my own health and well-being and recognize and adopt ways to promote and maintain personal resilience. Under competency 3.3, manages resources and finance, we've added in a behavior in relation to sustainability and climate action. So it's I consider the impact of my role has on the environment, use energy efficient systems, and contribute to waste reduction initiatives. And then finally, under domain 3 and competency 3.4, which is contributes to continuous quality improvement and risk management, and in recognition of the importance of good quality data to drive evidence-based decisions. We've added a behavior which is that I contribute to audit activities and understand the value and importance of using feedback from complaints and audit to improve and develop services. Under the pharmacy care domain then, domain 4, again, this is in recognition of advancements in practice that have happened and been introduced since the first competency framework was developed. So competency 4.3, which is dispenses, supplies, and administers medicines, a new behaviour has been added, which recognises that pharmacists now are often administering medicines, including vaccinations. So I supply and administer medicines, including vaccinations, as appropriate to my role and level of training. Within the same domain, we have the Competency 4.6, which is leads for safety. And the behaviour that we've added or strengthened here in particular, it relates to the importance of not just recording, but also reviewing and learning from near misses and errors in practice. And then also the importance of sharing and implementing improvements and preventive measures. And finally, under domain 4, within Competency 4.7, which is provides medicines, information and education. And again, considering the importance of person-centered care and patient empowerment, a behaviour has been added in relation to I consider my audience when providing information, taking into account any additional needs they have, and check understanding. And then finally, under domain 5, public health, 2 new behaviours have been added under Competency 5.1, which is participates in population health initiatives. And these, I suppose, are 2 very much front and centre areas of practice for many pharmacists. So the first is in relation to antimicrobial stewardship. So I adhere to the principles of good antimicrobial stewardship and infection prevention and control, and keep up to date with national guidelines to limit the development of antimicrobial resistance. And we'll all be aware of the important role that pharmacists have to play in this, and the importance of the important role that antimicrobial stewardship and infection prevention and control plays in many pharmacists' practice. And then finally, one that we probably didn't think we needed to consider back in when the first framework was being developed, but is very much front and center now. And this is pandemic and preparedness. And it was important, I think, in recognition of the important role that pharmacists ended up playing in the response to the COVID-19 emergency, that there would be a behaviour in relation to this. So the behaviour has been added that is, as you'll see there, I participate in national initiatives and planning in preparation and response to disaster situations, pandemics and public health emergencies. So that's just a brief overview of some of the key changes. That's not all of them. And you'll see yourself when you start working through in a bit of detail that there are others, but just wanted to give a flavour of some of the changes that were made and maybe give some context as to why they were introduced. And then
Dan, just before you go on.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. There's just one question asking to clarify what you meant by e-health.
Of course, yeah.
It means health mail, but just to clarify.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's anywhere where technology interacts with healthcare, essentially, is how you would define e-health. And in the pharmacy setting, that could be electronic prescribing within hospitals, and obviously there and you may be aware that there is a national e-prescribing project underway, which is looking to develop an e-prescribing solution for primary care. And I suppose it's important to note that as well as reflecting current practice, there is an element of trying to future-proof as well within the core competency framework, so that it will stand us in good stead for the next 5 years. And then, as you mentioned, Emily, yes, things like health mail, PharmaVax, and telehealth as well has become more apparent, and particularly since COVID-19. And there's been pharmacies offering online consultations or online booking systems for vaccinations, or offering even and more pharmacies now offering delivery of non-prescription pharmacy medicines as well. So so I suppose it's that kind of umbrella term that's used for anywhere where technology and healthcare interact. And within that, there's I suppose a recognition that there's a level of digital competence that all pharmacists need. It will vary based on how big of a role it plays within your practice. So it can be to a very proficient level, or it can be to a basic level, but it was important, we felt, that was recognized within the framework.
Thanks, million, Dan. I know we said we do the questions at the end, but it just seemed to be relevant to not miss it as we went by there. Thank you.
Not at all. That's great, Emily. Thanks. So then, just before we move on to the case studies, one of the areas that we received a lot of feedback on in all of our work in developing the revised framework was in relation to the role of behaviours within the core competency framework. So it became apparent that there was a need for some greater clarity on how behaviours were to be used, and how they can be how they can support pharmacists in identifying their CPD needs, and also, I suppose, to clarify that the behaviours provided aren't prescriptive or exhaustive. So they are intended to be examples. They're indicative behaviours, and that's the terminology we're using just to make that really clear in the competency framework, in the revised core competency framework. They're there to help understand whether or how a competency is relevant to a pharmacist or to a student by describing some common ways that the competency can be demonstrated. But there's an acknowledgement that there are many other ways that a competency could be demonstrated. And pharmacists in practice may find that some competencies do not apply to them anymore as they progress through their career, as they become more specialized, as they move into diverse roles, or develop expertise in specific or different areas. And there also may be times where a competency does apply, or you feel it does apply, but then when you review the indicative behaviors provided, you might decide, first of all, yes, the behaviors do apply to me, and therefore you can use those to self-assess how well you demonstrate the competency. You might decide that some of the behaviors are relevant, but actually others aren't. And in this case, you consider those that are applicable and reflect against those. And if relevant, you can consider, are there other ways that you might demonstrate how you meet the competency? And thirdly, you might decide, actually, no, none of the behaviors are relevant to my role, but I do still feel that that competency is relevant to me. And if that applies, you consider, are there other ways by which you demonstrate that you meet the competency? And if so, you can use that for the basis of your self-reflection and identification of development needs. And that sounds quite theoretical. So what I'm going to do next is hopefully bring that to life a little bit and show you by way of 2 case studies how that might work. So the first one is an example of a pharmacist in a patient-facing role. The second will be of a pharmacist in a non-patient-facing role. So I'll introduce you to Charlie. So Charlie is a supervising pharmacist working 4 days per week in a community pharmacy situated beside a busy GP surgery. The pharmacy also provides services to 3 residential care homes in the town. So Charlie is doing a bit of planning for his CPD, and he decides to make a plan for some activities for the year ahead. So he knows that the core competency framework is an important tool to use when reflecting on his needs, and he accesses this and logs onto his ePortfolio on the IIOP website. He works his way through the core competency framework, and he selects competency 4.4, provides patient consultations and counselling within the pharmacy care domain, which is domain 4. And he reviews the behaviours provided, the indicative behaviours. So Charlie reflects on recent consultations he's had with patients and notices that there's an increasing number of consultations taking place over the phone. And from some recent interactions with patients, he believes that some of his counselling skills are not as effective over the phone as they are in person. He does consider that all of the behaviours under this competency are relevant to him, so that was step 1. And then he picks out behaviour 4.4.1, which is highlighted there. So I use appropriate questioning techniques to gather relevant information from patients and carers as an area in which he has opportunities for further development. So Charlie plans to complete some activities. So he does a search for online resources on effective phone consultation skills, and he decides he's going to attend a webinar on successful pharmacist consultations. So he then takes the following steps. So he watches a recording of the webinar in 2 sittings. He uses a tool for evaluating consultations provided as part of the webinar, and he reads the Telephone Consultations Calgary-Cambridge guide, which he found on the HSE website. So he goes back into his ePortfolio and to the cycle that he'd created in relation to this learning activity, and he documents the following within his ePortfolio. So he learned that posture and facial expressions can affect how empathy is conveyed in phone consultations. He learned about a new tool to help patients participate actively and as an equal in consultations. And he's using a tool now to evaluate their consultations, which has helped Charlie pinpoint skills and behaviours he needs to work on further improving. So Charlie then sat by the side of a lake and did some reflection on his practice and the evaluation it had had. So 3 months later, he thought about the cycle and the impact that it's had on his practice. And he said he's decided that he feels more confident in his counselling skills and that its consultations both over the phone actually and in person are more structured and patient-centered. So that's case study number one, and it's a fairly straightforward one in that the competency that Charlie looked at applied to him. He identified a behavior within that resonated with him as an area for development, and he took the relevant steps to address that. So then case study number two. So this is Jamie, and Jamie is a pharmacovigilance scientist working for a multinational pharmaceutical manufacturer, and her background prior to this role was as a hospital pharmacist. So again, Jamie, it's January time, and that's when Jamie usually kind of does her planning for the year ahead for her CPD activities. So she knows that the core competency framework should be consulted when reflecting on her needs. She accesses this and logs into her ePortfolio on the IIOP website. And Jamie selects competency 1.3, establishes and maintains collaborative working relationships, which is in the personal domain, domain number 1. And she reviews the behaviors provided. So she does consider that this competency is relevant to her in her practice. But actually, she considers that only 2 out of the 5 behaviors are relevant to her and her current role. And she is confident that she is demonstrating these 2 behaviors at a proficient level. Therefore, she identifies an additional behavior that is not provided in the core competency framework, but is relevant to her role. And through conversations with her manager, she identifies it as an area for development. So Jamie identified this behavior as, I engage in networking behaviors by attempting to develop and maintain professional relationships. Jamie is relatively new to her current role and determines that improvement in this area is likely to boost her professional confidence. She decides to plan some CPD activity to further develop in this area. So as Charlie did, she goes to the personal plan stage and completes the following activities. So she asks her direct manager for feedback. She watches a recording of, she decides she's going to watch a recording of the Strengthening Our Connections networking webinar hosted by the IIOP. And then she also searches the peer website for resources as she is a peer member, with peer being the Pharmacists in Industry, Education and Regulation. So Jamie takes the following steps. So during her regular one-to-one meetings, she asks her manager for guidance and constructive feedback regarding her networking behaviors and the activities she's carried out to date. She watches the Strengthening Our Connections IIOP webinar, and she also attended a networking event hosted by peer. So once she's completed those activities, she logs back into her IIOP portal and into her ePortfolio and documents the following. So she's decided that she's learned that useful opportunities and advice can come from the people at the periphery of your professional network or people you might have lost touch with. She's learned about the personal boardroom concept, which helped Jamie put a structure in place to networking and helped her to think about it more intentionally. And she learned about the benefits and pitfalls to networking over social media using on applications such as LinkedIn. And then Jamie went for a walk in the field and decided to evaluate the impact on her practice. And this was 3 months later, after she had undertaken those activities. And she observed that she has been participating in more professional activities and has actually reconnected with a friend from college who's also currently working in a large pharmaceutical company. So there are the 2 case studies that I just wanted to bring you through, just to show you different ways that you might use the core competency framework, both where all of the competencies and behaviors apply to your role or practice, and also where maybe they don't or only partially do, and how you might decide to demonstrate a competency, or that you do demonstrate a competency in a different way, but an equally valid and an important way. So that's it from me. So before I hand over to Alicia, just to remind us what we went through. So I described what the core competency framework is and what are its uses, explained why it was updated and what has changed, gave an overview of its structure, so the domains, competencies and behaviors. And we discussed 2 case studies on examples of how you might use the core competency framework within your practice to support your CPD. So thank you, everybody. Happy to take any questions at the end, and I will hand you over to Alicia.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Dan. I found that very interesting anyway. I love those case studies, really help to bring it to life. And so I am just going to share my screen, so just bear with me a minute. And so can I just check? Can everyone see that?
Yep,
you can hear me
coming up.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
Perfect.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us here today. I see there's quite a big number, so great to have you all here on the webinar. I'm going to look at the practical implications for CPD. Probably take about no more than 15 minutes anyway, probably 10 to 15 minutes. As Emily mentioned, there were a few questions that people asked that I would hope to cover in the content I go through now. But if there's anything you feel hasn't been fully covered, then I'm happy to go through it in further detail afterwards. So to consider the practical implications for CPD, the first thing to consider is that from this point forward, it is the revised CCF that needs to be used as the basis for self-assessment for CPD. So as we saw, there is a requirement for all pharmacists on a regular basis to carry out a self-assessment having regard to the core competency framework for pharmacists. So given that there is now a new version of the core competency framework, it is of course this new revised CCF that needs to be used instead of the older 2013 CCF. The next thing to consider, which has been covered by Dan, but just to mention it, self-assessment will now be against indicative behaviours rather than prescribed behaviours. So the revised core competency framework mentions indicative behaviours, and this is a really good benefit as it allows greater flexibility and adaptation of the CCF to your own practice area. And I think this was really demonstrated well in the second case study that Dan looked at there. So the next practical implication, which I'll spend a little bit more time going through, is that the IIOP Core Competency Self-Assessment Tool, or the CSAT, is no longer available from the 14th of November. So I imagine that most of you here today will know what the CSAT is. So the CSAT, you would have been able to access it through your IIOP ePortfolio. You can see the icon there, and when you click on it, it would bring you through to a screen that might look like this, which would allow you to start a self-assessment. So this video here demonstrates an example of the CSAT being used. But basically, it was a tool that was developed to enable pharmacists to assess against the 2013 core competency framework. So pharmacists were taken through each domain, each competency and prescribed behaviour, and then asked to evaluate the level of importance you attach to each particular behaviour, as well as your level of competence in relation to each behaviour. This then generated suggested competencies to focus on for further development. So I suppose to highlight, there were, of course, positives and negatives with the CSAT. The CSAT did serve an important purpose in helping to increase awareness of the core competency framework and its role in CPD. It provided a structure to assist with self-assessment, and it did provide suggested competencies for development. However, as many pharmacists here this evening might agree with, many pharmacists found it quite a long and cumbersome task to complete a CSAT. And indeed, we did get quite a bit of feedback that pharmacists thought it was very much a tick box exercise. And it took quite a bit of time to do. And then sometimes the competencies that were suggested for development, pharmacists might not fully agree with these competencies that they needed to be focused on. The other thing is that it restricted self-assessment to the prescribed behaviours. So a tool such as this is not as relevant now when we're at a situation that it's moved to more indicative behaviours, because you don't need to be asked questions on all of these extra behaviours, some of which might not actually be relevant to your particular role. The other thing with the CSAT is that it didn't allow any other input. And as we can see, self-assessment without any other input can be flawed. So taking all of this into account and considering that it was based on the older core competency framework, and of course now there is the new revised CCF, the decision was made to retire the CSAT. So The CSAT tool will no longer be available from the 14th of November this year. So I suppose what you might all be wondering is what this means for you, or what you need to do. And well, for the majority of pharmacists, no action is required. You just need to be aware that from the 14th of November, you will no longer be able to complete a CSAT. So when you're completing a self-assessment, it's not going to be using this tool. So in most cases, that's all you need to be aware of. However, there are situations where action is required. So pharmacists that have a pending CSAT self-assessment, or who have completed a CSAT self-assessment and not yet downloaded or exported that, there is action that needs to be completed here. You are advised to download or export this information before the 14th of November if you wish to retain it for your records. So just to show you what I mean by that, if you log on to your ePortfolio, click on the CSAT link, it'll bring you into your CSAT. If you see you have an assessment that looks like this, that says something like 50% complete, this is showing that you have a pending CSAT assessment. You then need to go and continue and complete this self-assessment if you do not want to lose that data. So if you don't have a pending self-assessment, it would look like this. So you would have self-assessments there, and as you can see on the top right, it would say something like the date that this assessment was finalized. So in this case, it's likely you have no action that you need to carry out, because you finished the CSAT assessment, and most likely you would have already exported your self-assessment summary into your ePortfolio. But if you're not sure if you have exported your summary, what you can always do is, when you're in this screen here, click on the View Export Self-Assessment Summary, which brings you to a page like this, and then you have the option to click that you want to export the self-assessment summary. So here in this example, as we see on screen, I've clicked the ePortfolio self-assessment to export it to the ePortfolio, and it is giving me information here that I have this complete and that it will now be exported into my ePortfolio. If instead you're getting a message like this, this tells you that you've actually already exported this information into your ePortfolio, and in that case, there's nothing further you need to do. You have it in your ePortfolio, so the information will not be lost. So I suppose one thing I will cover is what this means for ePortfolio review. Now, I do know that probably quite a lot of pharmacists here this evening have not been called for ePortfolio review this year, but for those that have, there have been quite a few that have sent in questions wondering, what does the retirement of the CSAT mean for my ePortfolio that I need to submit in January 2024? So just to let you know, even though the CSAT is being retired in November, any CSAT generated cycles that you have already completed this year can be used and submitted as part of your ePortfolio review in January. And just to mention as well, although there is a revised core competency framework, any cycles created following self-assessment against the older 2013 core competency framework can, of course, be used and submitted for your ePortfolio review in January. So I won't go into any further detail about ePortfolio review, but if you have particular questions, I can either answer them after this, or else I will be giving you information on ePortfolio review webinars that will cover ePortfolio review in a lot more detail. So the final practical implication I'm going to look at is that your ePortfolio cycle will look slightly different in the self-appraisal stage. So we have now included a hyperlink to the revised CCF, and we have also included the revised CCF domains and competencies. So this video here now, which I'll just start playing. So we just created this video as a way of showing you a test cycle being created to demonstrate these stages or these changes to you. So we're just in here creating a new cycle. And as you'll know, you'd need to put in your cycle title, select your start date, and then you select the stage that you want to start the cycle at, which we'll use the self-appraisal. for the purpose of this cycle. So when you proceed then to create the cycle and you go into the self-appraisal section, of course, as you know, there's the box where you input the information on how you identified your learning needs. The first way here is by completing self-assessment against the core competency framework. This is now a hyperlink which brings you to the CCF on the PSI website. The other addition is the CCF domains and competencies are now listed here in self-appraisal, and that is to give you the opportunity to select the domains and the competencies that are relevant to the cycle that you are just about to create. So I'll just move on from that there because I know it goes into a little bit further detail in the rest of the cycle, which we don't need to cover this evening. So that brings me to the end of my part of the presentation, but just to highlight to you, we are going to be facilitating a number of roadshows which will discuss CPD and the revised core competency framework. So they will help with the practical changes, but in particular, they will help with how to self-assess against the core competency framework, particularly now that the CSAT is no longer available. So these roadshows will take place in the areas mentioned here on the dates mentioned, and you can register to attend any of these events in the courses and events section on our website. We also have a series of other information and training workshops which may be of benefit to you to help with the self-assessment and the change to the revised CCF. So for example, there's going to be giving and receiving effective feedback workshops, and these are virtual workshops taking place in October. So these will help in that they will look at how you can ask for feedback from perhaps a colleague or your manager, and then use this feedback to help inform your self-assessment against the core competency framework. There's also reflective practice webinars where you will get an insight into how reflective practice can be used to help you with self-assessment and identifying your learning needs. We do, of course, have quite a few ePortfolio review webinars on the dates listed there. So that will tell you everything you need to know about your ePortfolio review, and that will be in particular for those called to submit in January 2024. And then for those of you who are perhaps newer to the CPD system, the Introduction to CPD webinar will provide an excellent overview of the CPD system and the role of the IIOP. So I'll now hand you back to Emily. But just to keep in mind, I'm certainly able to answer any questions you have either on the content that I've listed or if there's anything else in relation to the CCF and how it might impact your CPD. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks a million, Alicia. And thanks to Joanne and Dan. That was a really informative presentation from all three of you. I think, Joanne, you set the tone very well. I felt very reflective as we went through the last 50 minutes. And Dan, I think the case studies definitely do bring it to life, and you feel how the flexibility of those indicative behaviours and how you can use them. And Alicia, I think the video was great in terms of seeing exactly how you do the cycle. And I think, you know, there's been two kind of questions around the CSAT and people feeling a bit anxious about, you know, if they were used to doing that every year and suddenly it's gone, how do you feel? I know a lot of people did do it the other option of ticking the box in their cycle, but there's been, yeah, that's really the only questions around a little bit of anxiety around the CSAT and the difference of not having it.
Oh yes, and look, I can understand that. So I suppose just to say what we found is that when the option, so it used to be when ePortfolio first came in that it was compulsory for all pharmacists to complete a CSAT. Then in 2018, from then on, we made it optional for pharmacists to complete a CSAT or instead to self-assess in a similar way to, for example, how Joanne said she would have done it, download a copy of the core competency framework, and as Dan would have illustrated in his case studies, perhaps pick a domain, pick a few competencies and self-assess from there. So when we gave the option that you could do something like that instead and then tick the box in your cycle, we found the majority of pharmacists have actually been doing it that way. So for most pharmacists, they're comfortable without and prefer not to use a CSAT. But I do understand change, you know, change can certainly be difficult. If it's suited, if you had the opportunity to attend the CCF roadshow, We will be going into a lot of detail of how to complete a self-assessment against the core competency framework. In particular, we'll be looking at how ways by using objective evidence, through the use of reflective practice, and perhaps by the use of feedback, how these areas in particular can help with the self-assessment. I'm not sure if that answers your questions, if you've any more in particular, but yeah, we'd hope that everyone would still be confident completing the self-assessment. And I suppose really the tool served a purpose at a moment in time, and then no longer would serve that purpose, considering it's now indicative behaviours, and we've moved away from the prescribed behaviours.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. And I think there's a few people that have been called for ePortfolio this year, so there are other ePortfolio webinars going on, and there's resources on the website around that specifically. Jane has asked, and you've clarified it very well, Jane, that for 2023 the old form of CSAT can be submitted up to, but you have to have exported it by November, so you understood that perfectly. And then Alan is asking, will the roadshow on the 20th cover the same information as tonight's webinar? Alicia, you're saying there might be a bit more detail or a bit more information there.
There certainly is. So the roadshow will cover these practical implications for anyone that might not be on the webinar this evening, but we'll go into a lot more detail about the use of core competency frameworks, and then in particular self-assessment. So we will be making it a very interactive roadshow, so there will be practical examples given, and there will be some guidance given on how to improve your self-assessment against the core competency framework, concentrating on those areas of objective evidence, reflective practice and feedback. So it'll certainly be a lot more detail than we went into this evening.
And Joanne, you mentioned that there's also PSI roadshows as well coming up.
That's right, Emily. We've a number of PSI roadshows throughout October. We are not clashing with the IIOP roadshows, so we'll be available on different dates, and we intend keeping everyone very busy during October, both of us. But we'd be delighted to see you there. We've sent out an email to all registrants this afternoon. We'd ask you to register for to attend, and I suppose we carried out a survey earlier on in the summer asking registrants what are the areas that you would like to hear from the PSI as part of those roadshows. So we're focusing on the work that we carried out earlier this year on the emerging risks to the future pharmacy workforce, and we know that there's a number of actions and recommendations that we really like to engage with the profession on, and just to inform you about the work that we're going to be carrying out following the publication of that report. We're also going to have a little bit on fitness to practice and legal affairs, because that's an area that always concerns registrants, and an area that we'd like to, I suppose, engage with you on, and to provide you with relevant information, but also perhaps some reassurance around the process. And we're also, I suppose, providing information to pharmacists who are in governance roles, or those who might be considering taking up governance roles. And again, Emily, you'll be aware, and I think a lot of people are aware, that the role of the supervising pharmacist is a role that I suppose a number of pharmacists would like to get further clarification on. Superintendent, I think most people we don't have as many superintendent queries, but a number of queries around the role of the supervising pharmacist and what is involved in terms of taking up that role, in particular around what's meant by whole-time charge. So an opportunity for you to ask us questions, to engage with us, and we're really looking forward to returning to in-person events. We haven't been able to do so because of the pandemic. We have roadshows in October, but also there'll be an opportunity to have further roadshows in 2024. We would really love to have as many registrants as possible attend in October. Thanks, Emily.
Very good. That sounds like a very interesting and informative evening, and definitely a lot of the hot topics we all talk about when we're meeting around the country. Very good. I think that's it. There doesn't seem to be any more questions popping up. I don't know, have I missed anything or anyone thing? I think the main things are around anyone doing ePortfolio this year, and I think there are those other resources on the IIOP website that you can log on and get. I don't know if anybody else want to ask anything else. If not, Audrey might stick in the survey. She might put in a little survey in the box. So we love getting feedback here in the IIOP about what worked well, what didn't work, what you'd like to see more of. So she's going to pop a little survey in the chat box, and we'd really appreciate if you'd fill that out. As well, I'm definitely feeling reflective after tonight, but if you're feeling reflective and energetic, you might also think about filling out a CPD cycle, logging straight onto the ePortfolio website and filling one out now, or putting the title in for another time, but definitely one that will be a really good cycle for this year. And then just to mention, the next webinar will be on the 27th of September, where Bernard Duggan, Maria Daly and Stephen Doran of the Medicines Management Programme will be back. And they're going to give an update on biosimilars and the Best Value Biologics Initiative and the Medicines Management Programme reimbursement application systems. So the invitations will be sent out in the normal way, so keep an eye on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and your emails for invites to that. So unless there's anything else, no, lots of thank yous. Thanks for the clarifications, very interesting. So very well done to the three speakers. You really clarified everything for everyone and really got, I think, answered all any queries or anything that people had before as you went through the presentations, which was great. So yeah, without any further ado, to say thanks a million for coming on an evening, and wishing you all a lovely rest of the evening. Thanks a million. We'll see you on the 27th for the next webinar.